We'll be moving on to our second keynote address for today, which is on Ezumezu logic as a decolonial system of order. It will be given by Professor Scott L. Pratt. Professor Scott L. Pratt is the head of philosophy at the University of Oregon, USA. His research and teaching interests are in American philosophy, philosophy of education, and the history of logic. He has authored and co-edited many books, including Logic, Inquiry, Arguments and Order, and American Philosophy from Wounded Knee to the Present. He has also published numerous articles on logic and indigenous American philosophy. Unfortunately, Professor Pratt could not attend this conference due to unforeseen circumstances. Dr. Arabia David Atto will give the lecture on his behalf. Dr. Atto, please, you can speak to us. Thank you.
All right, I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can hear you. Go on.
All right. So this is a paper by Scott Pratt, and the title is Ezumezu Logic as a Decolonial System of Orders. What I'll do is just read out what he has sent in. All right, so Ezumezu logic marks an important contribution to decolonial critical and constructive projects. Logic, most often viewed in the US as an incidental subject matter studied by students seeking to escape a math requirement or maybe prepare for law school exams, is rather a central element in understanding how communities and their ways of thinking and relating are organized. I proceed here from a perspective framed by early 20th century American philosophers and logicians such as Josiah Royce and C.S. Pierce, responding at once to the increasing abstraction of philosophical idealism at the time and the increasing narrowness of logical studies under the influence of turn-of-the-century logicism. Royce declared that logic is the science of order. He addressed the topic of order this way. The one great task of the intellect is to comprehend the orderly aspects of the real and of the ideal world. The conception of order lies, therefore, just as much as at the basis of an effort to define our ideals of character and society as at the basis of arithmetic, geometry, or the quantitative sciences in general. It is therefore not a matter of mere accident or of mere play on words that if one publishes a book called simply A Treatise on Order or The Doctrine of Order, we cannot tell from the title whether it is a treatise on social problems or on preserving an orderly social order against anarchy, or with studying those unsymmetrical and transitive relations, those operations and correlations upon which the theory of arithmetical, geometrical, and logical order depend. The bridge that should connect our logic and mathematics with our social theories is still unfinished. The future must and will find such a bridge. In effect, Royce understood order thinking and ordered experience to be meaningful precisely because they are ordered in a particular way. Carpentry, photosynthesis, math, poetry, music, geology, etc. are all ordered as particular systems and as systems interacting with each other. Logic, from this perspective, is the order of processes and things, and the name of the field of the study that considers how things are ordered in the most general sense. Standard approaches to logic taken in philosophy or in logic classes represent efforts to study a particular order, which is how humans think or speak, or even both. Such narrowness, of course, leaves out some, perhaps most systems of order that are ignored or subjected to the laws of limited formal logic. Such impositions of a limited logic, I have argued elsewhere, are part of the process of colonization, at least as it was carried out in the Americas. But more on that later. On the account I suggest, it should be clear that the scope of logic as a general study of order should find that the way communities are ordered, that is their value systems, laws, emotional connections, etc., are all orders relevant for logical consideration. To the extent that they are orders, there is an invariant dimension, a structure on which the particulars hang. Such structures make space for some elements, exclude others, and determine what counts and what does not count. What Royce sought was the most general logic, the most general principle of order that will provide insight into the traditional areas of logic and also be a resource for understanding experiences of all sorts. Human, more than human, more than human, small scale and large. Okay, sorry, I'll take that again. What Royce sought was the most general logic, the most general principle of order that would provide insight into the traditional areas of logic and also be a source for understanding experiences of all sorts, so human experiences, whether small scale and large scale. His colleague Peirce shared many of the same aspirations, arguing that logic finally framed the structure of reality and the sciences that study it, eventually proposing metaphysical categories and a theory of science that identified the invariants in both ontology and meaning. While neither Royce nor Peirce can be seen as thinkers who aim to take on colonization, racism, sexism, or oppression in its other forms, their work was nevertheless a philosophy of resistance that can aid those efforts. Just as others in the North American philosophical tradition sought to use philosophy to undermine the limits and exclusion of American society, Royce and Peirce sought to undermine the limits of 19th century European descended thought, as it had come to dominate philosophy and the sciences in North America. Even as they affirmed the dominant social structure and ongoing European and American empires, they saw that the systems as received stood in the way of understanding human experience and the place of the humans in the wider world. Central to their consideration were two issues: the role of judgment in experience and the status of possibility, what Peirce called being in futuro. Jonathan Chimakonam's development of Ezumezu logic can, from the standpoint of logic as the science of order, be seen as a cultural specific order system that is framed in relation to the dominant European descended system, but also as descent from its important ways. It provides resources to see what is lost in the dominant system and introduces the possibility of rethinking logic as a grounding order for fostering a distinctive African world and way of living. My plan here is to first review aspects of Ezumezu logic and summarize its relation to the dominant system in order to consider, second, the implication of Chimakonam's assessment of the system. He, that is Chimakonam, writes, Ezumezu logic is not a new or unique logic, different from logic as it is conventionally known. As different traditions such as relevance, paraconsistent, three-valued, four-valued, multi-valued logics, etc., have come to be developed as an extension of the big umbrella or logic whose main differences are in the expansioning or loosening of the laws which guide reasoning with them. Ezumezu joins that league as a variant of three-valued logic. I will argue that Ezumezu and the dominant formal system of logic are both instances of a wider system of order, and that in light of this larger system, Ezumezu can be seen to be a more inclusive order with the potential to serve not only as a resource for development, for the development of an African logic, but as a critical and constructive resource for decolonization around the world. What the dominant order lacks and what enables its power as a colonizing tool is that it erases the role of the agent and eliminates the relevance of possible futures. Ezumezu logic restores or potentially restores both elements. I will first summarize what I take to be the key elements in Ezumezu, and then briefly present key elements of the wider agential logic proposed by Royce. Finally, I will suggest how, in the light of this logic of agency, Ezumezu can provide a model of how logic can also take into account the role of purpose and alternative futures. Now, Chimakonam accepts the more or less standard idea of logic as a systematic study of the principles of correct reasoning, part of the edifice of logic. But unlike dominant views of logic, Chimakonam also makes two claims. First, there are multiple logics dependent on contextual applications, and the rules of reasoning affirm, that is, different rules accepted as a result of adapting to context amount to different logics. Second, since logics are responsive to context, they are also tied to culture, broadly understood. African logic is adapted to African background, ontology, and worldview. Since Ezumezu is closely connected with the African context and is part of the edifice of logic generally, and so also to colonizers' logic, it can be used as a critical tool to examine the dominant logic in order to identify its impact on Africa. Dominant logic, for example, has been used as the standard of reasoning such that those who do not use it are marked as irrational and lesser beings. The rules of colonizer logic have been used to exclude ideas, categories, and people from access to opportunities. The same dominant logic that sets standards and excludes individuals and groups have also been used to undercut African traditions and history. At the same time, the commitment of Ezumezu can serve as an instrument of decolonization by supporting the restoration of African traditions and providing a framework for the Africanization of education. Now, Chimakonam claims that Ezumezu logic gains its structure and value by serving as an, quote, accurate mapping of African systems of thought. The resulting logic has three key features. First, it is, as already mentioned, a three-valued logic or a three-valued system that is para-consistent. That is, it does not permit explosion ex falso quodlibet. The three values are true, false, and, quote, the third value described as Ezumezu, where the two polar values, truth and falsity, complement. Second, Ezumezu logic is aromaristic. Such reasoning recognizes, quote, a peripheral variable or agent who from that position can challenge the proposals or claims of other agents. Agreement of the agents is marked as the center, and so reasoning in a traditional African context uses a method of making inferences from the periphery to the center. This pattern of reasoning is aromaristic and contrasts with the ohakaristic method that makes inferences from the center, that is, from proposals taken as acceptable or applicable to all agents, to agential particulars or on the periphery. An aromaristic method marks a creative struggle. The term aromaruka names the method that brings two seemingly opposed variables into a logical relationship in which the identity of the separate variables can be strengthened in the collective, while ohakarisi brings opposed variables into a logical relationship in which the identity of the separate variables come together to strengthen the collective. The former preserves difference in relation to the collective, while the latter fosters a kind of unification. Despite the terms or points of views being at odds, they are not engaged in a dialectic in the Hegelian sense. The two processes are rather in relation through what Chimakonam calls or called the conversational curve. Third, Ezumezu logic is value complementary in that it affirms truth gluts, that is, A can be both true and false, and so is dialetheic. Complementarity here is not the complementarity of ordinary set theory, in which the complement of A, for example, is everything not A. Rather, if A is true and its complement not A is also true, then a third value in addition to true and false is generated such that marks both terms as true. This is a true truth value called Ezumezu. Now, Royce and Pierce called the Ezumezu value betweenness, a value to label the intersection of complementary or adverse terms that are both true. In Royce's system, the relation of complementarity is described as the O relation, the obverse relation, a relation of incompatibility. If the complementary relation is true or holds for two or more terms, another term C is generated, which is at once compatible with A and compatible with B, but where the three terms A, B, and C are not compatible, that is, they are complementary. Formally, Ezumezu logic endorses 6 laws. The standard law of the dominant or colonizer's logic are identity, non-contradiction, and excluded. I add 3 new laws to these, Chimakonam writes, Njikoka, Mmekoka, and Onona Etiti, in lieu of the fact that the ideas of absolute identity, absolute difference, and mutual exclusivity, which the 3 traditional laws project, in addition to serving a purpose of consistency in reasoning, actually undermine dynamism and shortchange other facets of human reasoning by being overtly deterministic. The law of Njikoka, which Chimakonam also calls integrativity, is an aromaristic proposition that marks relationships, relationality, and integration. The general idea is that meaning is relational and is derived from variables when they come together. A is true if and only if A is true in relation to or, which implies A and B is true. The oppression wedge implies is a strengthened form of the material conditional. It is similar to a ceteris paribus conditional used in conditional logic, not as strong as a strict conditional, but stronger than a material conditional, in that it requires that all things are equal in the relation of the antecedent and the consequence. A is true if and only if all things being equal, if A is true, then if A, then A and B is true. Note that Chimakonam reformulates Njikoka later in a later paper as A is true if and only if A is true in relation to its opposite, not A, that is false. In effect, the context requires that if A is true, then all things being equal, or in this context, not A, has the truth value false. And A and not A are integrated if and only if all things being equal, A is true and not A is false. The law of Mmekoka, which is complementarity, is also an aromaristic proposition. Mmekoka also marks contextuality, but a context in which, given that A is true, not A is also true. So A and not A are complementary if and only if A is true in a context, then not A cannot be false in that context. Here, Ezumezu is like a first-degree entailment system of the sort described by Graham Priest, in which A is assigned true relative to X, and not A is also assigned true relative to X. So A and not A is true in relation to the context of X. The law of ononaitity is also called the included middle, and it is an all-hacaristic proposition. Like the truth value Ezumezu, Ononaititi marks something between. Chimakonam observes that the principle closely interprets the Igbo concept of the same name, meaning between others, that which comes to the middle. This can be taken as meaning A could be true and false, or if a thing is equal to itself, it can be unequal to or different from itself, depending on context. The three principles of Ezumezu logic are taken in relation to a context framed by two theses. The first is the ontological thesis, which is realities exist not only as independent units at the periphery of the circle of existence, but also as entities capable of coming together to the center of the circle of existence in a network for an interdependent relationship. Ezumezu then is framed by a relational ontology. The second thesis is the logical thesis, which says values are to be allocated to propositions, not on the basis of facts such propositions are set, but on the basis of the context in which these propositions are asserted. Truth then is context dependent. Taken together, the dynamic character of relational ontology is engaged through claims that are also dynamic, since what is true changes with changing context. A world characterized by these commitments undermines absolute and universal principles and the structure of colonial logic that reinforce them. What is the relation of the Ezumezu principles and those of Western or dominant logic? Strictly speaking, if the principles of the dominant system are accepted without qualification, then those principles will override Ezumezu principles, which clearly violate them. If these principles capture the common commitments of the African culture, then accepting the dominant logic is to override and reject the core ordering principles of African life. But in a world characterized by the ontological and logical thesis of Ezumezu logic, the relational and contextual framework allows the Western principles to be used, but only within a context in which they are accepted, explicitly or implicitly. The thesis of Ezumezu, which are the principles of relational and contextual logic, are wide enough to contain both Western and Ezumezu logics, and so provide an account for both and mark their differences. From the Ezumezu perspective, or rather in an Ezumezu world, Western logic is compatible with Ezumezu as different systems, and suggests that the two systems are properly understood as subsystems of a more general logic that explains both. Chimakonam argues that the understanding of Western logic from the perspective of Ezumezu provides reason to try to set Western logic aside, even though it is a legitimate topic in its context. He proposes three goals to be satisfied by any logic. 1, to avoid inconsistency. 2, to avoid contradiction. And 3, to avoid absolute claims. Ezumezu logic, according to Chimakonam, accepts goals 1 and 3. Inconsistency is avoided when it can be, given Njikoka and Mekoka, because in light of goal 3, truth is context bound. Universal claims, weakened by the third goal, are to be understood as what Peirce called generals, claims that hold most of the time or probabilistically. Chimakonam argues that Ezumezu holds a universalness theorem that states any system of logic is universal if and only if its elementary formal statements are context-specific. By adopting the universal theorem, Ezumezu can also accept goal 2, since claims that without context might be of the form A and not A in context, that is, with truth values assigned within a context where A and not A, for example, can be both assigned true. Contradiction is avoided. Consequently, Ezumezu logic can accept all three goals of a successful system of logic. Western logic on this account fulfills the first two goals but rejects the third goal and the idea that truth is bound to context. On this standard, the dominant system of logic is less successful and, while clearly a viable system of order, ignores a key element of logic that responds to the commitment of African life and culture that demands responsiveness to context. Ezumezu logic is in many ways similar to a logic which frames the order systems common among North American indigenous peoples. Their central commitment to the need to order life in relation to particular lands and the recognition that agency, that is the ability to act with a purpose, is shared by humans, non-human beings, and complex systems such as tribes, lands, or places, species, etc. Indigenous logics like Ezumezu are not reducible to a single set of truths, since truth is relational and contextual. Instead, these indigenous logics might be characterized as having four broad features, which may also be characteristic of Ezumezu logic. First, such logics are modal in their recognition of the structure of possibility and necessity. Second, they are dialetheic in their affirmation that some contradictions are true. Third, these logics are paraconsistent in that the principle of explosion does not hold. Fourth and finally, these logic are intentional in that they will include the formal role of purposes or unrealized possibilities as causal in the processes of ordering and taking action. As a result, actions taken are also necessarily acts of sacrifice, in that whatever action is taken, other possible actions will never be actualized and so are irrevocably lost. I will claim, without argument here, that the diverse logics of colonized cultures share these characteristics and can be understood as subsystems of a more general logic that in turn can serve as a critical framework for advancing anti-colonial and decolonial efforts to transform philosophy, social sciences, and politics. A logic of agency that meets these most general conditions originated in the logical work of Josiah Royce. A logic of agency that meets these most general conditions originated in the logical works of Josiah Royce. Taken up in light of indigenous conceptions of agency, Royce's logic is a system of order grounded in the logical operation of obverse relation. That is, where A and not A is true. That is, it is based on a statement of possibilities such that the possibility A and not A are both true of the situation in which an agent can act. An agent, in order to act, selects from the two or more incompatible possibilities, and in doing so, irrevocably sets one line of action or set of possibilities aside and opens the other to new possibilities. The possibilities that are necessary in order that an agent be able to act are inconsistent, that is, are contradictory in that both cannot be taken together, and true, such that an agent has a real choice between them whenever the agent acts. Contradictions in Royce's logic are only ruled out in the context of actions taken. The principle of non-contradiction and excluded middle only hold for actions taken such that the other contradictory actions are consequently negated. Actions taken collapse the alternatives into an actual outcome based on the action taken, and eliminated possibilities, that is, the outcomes that would have followed had the other action been taken. Agency is not, however, acting through coercion or by chance. It is, to use a term proposed by Terence Deacon, intentional. Agency requires that the agent choose in light of some purpose and some bounded range of possibilities. Agency in this sense is not just the ability to act, but the ability to act with a purpose. These possibilities or future states are what Deacon has called absential phenomenon, that is, the paradoxical property of existing with respect to something missing, separate, and possibly non-existent. Phenomena whose existence is determined with respect to an essential absence. While dominant logic in its received form involves an agent and processes of inference framed by non-contradiction, excluded middle, and identity, this alternative logic involves an agent, two or more incompatible courses of action, and an organizing purpose or intention. Purposes on this account require the presence of real alternative futures, being in futuro. Like Ezumezu logic and indigenous North American logics, Royce's logic does not require ontological uniformity. In the way of most modern logics, his logic supposes plural worlds without regard to what kind of worlds they are. Rather than reducing the experience of different worlds, cultural or otherwise, to a single world, Royce can affirm dramatically different worlds of varied access and connections, despite being related to a common logic or system of order. Since past actions are inaccessible, that is, actions are not reversible, Royce's logic requires that unity, when it occurs only in the outcome of action. Origin stories, shared languages, and cultural forms are operative in the ordering process, but they are operative so as to realize possibilities, not to realize unity in the past. Royce's logic also implies norms. However, the logic does so without establishing the norm of consistency. As a result, where dominant logic establishes the expectation that rational thought always rejects contradiction and that thinkers who accept them are primitive by definition, Royce's logic requires inconsistency in the present moment so that agents can act. From the perspective of that logic, the demand for consistency amounts to the demand that agency sees in favor of a static system of actions, beliefs, and values that are all compatible with each other. Where dominant logic expects epistemic and practical access across cultural and other differences, Royce's logic expects only limited access. Bridging differences, that is, going beyond obvious relationships that mark boundaries, requires that the generation of a third term, like ononaititi in Ezumezu logic, but where the third term is a future state or purpose in terms of which the present inconsistency of a boundary can find a common orientation. Shared purposes constitute the point of contact for joint or collective actions, but do not require that the divergent courses of action unify except in relation to the issue at hand. The result is that access across differences is possible, but only happens locally around the possible shared purpose, and not universally where the two sides can be reduced to a single whole. While dominant logic requires that users seek consistency of action, beliefs, expectations, and so on, Royce's logic places agents in the midst of inconsistency, where beliefs, expectations, and worlds include contradictions that cannot be resolved in terms of the situation from which they emerge. It is only in action that contradictions collapse, such that a new line of possibilities is actualized, even as another line is lost forever. I have argued elsewhere that the dominant logic is a subsystem of the larger system of racist logic. In the dominant logic, the actions of agents are overdetermined by the narrowing of worlds to one, to the demand of consistency of beliefs and truth claims, the use of reductio arguments that rely on the principle of explosion, and the exclusion of purposes as making a formal difference in inference. The inconsistencies necessary for action still occur, but the possibilities excluded are overlooked or seen as possibilities destined to be left behind. The necessary organizing purposes are present as well, often captured by the idea that the judgments that direct actions are neutral or objective and so obscure the fact that they are nevertheless organizing purposes. Such logics work because it can operate within the larger system. That it has worked, however, has been central to the rise of settler colonialism and other systems of racial, gender-based, and economic oppression. To resist such systems, it is necessary to take up an alternate or wider logical perspective. Ezumezu logic, while aimed at fostering African culture and life, points towards this larger project. Royce's system, as a general logic, becomes a critical tool when one seeks to explain how the general system came to be limited by social, political, and economic and other forces that made it the narrow operating system that actually orders one's community and environment. If this approach is right, wider systems are possible. Narrower systems can be explained by what principles and actions serve to enforce the laws of the logical system that dominate. However, the larger framework raises the issue of what purposes are in place that frame the choices made. Elsewhere, I argue that the process of colonization is enabled by both logical structure that is imposed on the colonized and by a purpose or vision of colonized future to the advantage of the agents acting. Such agents are not necessarily human-sized agents, but can also be systems that, like individuals, operate towards some being in futuro. Criticism alone is insufficient as a response to an oppressive system and has the potential to reinforce it. Ezumezu logic is an example of a critical tool that provides constructive resources. Not only do the principles of the logic provide a model for cultivating how one can reason from a present situation to a future, but they also provide norms that can serve as unrealized states of affairs. These norms or futures include the expectation of pluralism, of the restoration of an African tradition of thought, the idea that value resides in both the center and the periphery, and so on. Finally, Ezumezu logic, in this case, is not an incidental subject matter, but a central philosophy of resistance. And this is where the talk ends.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Pratt, for your engaging lecture. And thank you, Dr. Arabia, for reading out Prof's lecture. Unfortunately, we won't be taking questions and comments for this lecture. And with this, we have come to the end of today's conference. I want to say thank you to our speakers for their thought-provoking lectures. Thank you to the Conversational School of Philosophy and the African Association for Logic, Philosophy of Science and Ethics of AI for collaborating with me on this important project. Thank you to my host, Professor Olivia, and all the participants. Thank you for your questions and your comments. Thank you for taking out the time to be here. Thank you all, and let the conversation continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciations, everybody. Greetings. I celebrate my teachers.
Thank you. Interesting.